The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. It was the start of the medieval period in Britain, a time of almost constant warfare, a time when bloody feuds dominated the landscape and brutal hand-to-hand combat ruled the battlefield. However, an invader from France, William the Conqueror, put an end to Anglo-Saxon England in 1066 and ushered in a new era. But by the end of the medieval period in Britain, it was now the English that were attempting to rule over France.
Nearly 3 centuries following England's initial subjugation to France, the two kingdoms would find their possessions and their royal lines entangled. The Normans, who had originally conquered the Anglo-Saxons of medieval England, would themselves see annexation into the courtship of Anjou, which would go on to annex and hold at various points England, Brittany, western France, as well as parts of Wales and Ireland. This new empire, which originated in what today we'd recognize as northern France, would go on to become the ruling force behind England for centuries. This diverging English identity becoming further solidified upon the conquest of Anjou proper by the French, leaving England's once extensive mainland domain now diminished to little more than the southwestern region of Gascony. This had been the result of speedy efforts to consolidate power in France during the Third Crusade, when both the French and English kings were away campaigning in the east, only for Philip Augustus of France to return early and seize English lands while they were unguarded. England's King Richard the Lionheart had soon returned and fought valiantly for what was rightfully his, and for a time appeared to hold the upper hand. However, he would pass away before conflicts fully concluded, and an unfavorable peace was negotiated with his successor, John Lackland. Despite King John's efforts to regain these lands, he'd ultimately find himself defeated, which turned many embittered English barons against him, motivating them to rise up and back the claim of then French Prince Louis VIII to the English throne, because at this point anybody was preferable to Lackland. Only upon the death of Lackland and the immediate coronation of his 9-year-old son Henry III did Louis's faction finally abandon this rival claim to the throne and expel the French forces from England. As the French further secured their hold over the mainland realm, so did hostility between the two kingdoms continue to rise. In 1308, over a century following the time of Richard Lionheart and Philip Augustus, the French and English had made a major effort to cool tempers and promote cooperation by marrying Isabella, the daughter of French King Philip IV, to the newly coronated King Edward II of England. Isabella would later betray her English husband by aligning herself with a rival baron. Together they would force Edward to concede the throne and take power for themselves before Edward II and Isabella's son, Edward III, retook direct control just some years later. But he desired more than just England. Not long after Edward's initial coronation, French King Charles the Fair had passed away, and given that his mother was Charles' sister, this left Edward the closest male heir to the throne. However, Isabella and other female lines had been recently excluded from inheriting the throne, passing the kingship down to one of Charles' cousins, Philip the Fortunate. The French and English were once again at odds as the succession dispute reinforced pre-existing English claims to French land, and would ultimately lead to the outbreak of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The French seized the southwestern territory of Gascony, England's largest remaining landholding on the mainland, and war would rage on here as the French attempted to subdue it. This first period of the 100 Years' War would prove largely successful for England, as they would force France to fight on multiple fronts by invading and capturing crucial territories on the northeastern coast, devastate the French navy to prevent a possible invasion of England itself, repel France's ally of Scotland, capturing their king in the process, and see their faction emerge victorious in the following War of Breton Succession. King Edward's son would eventually capture the French king and his heir, seemingly winning the war for England. However, conflicts did not fully conclude, and so Edward negotiated a peace treaty which provided extensive land gains for England at the cost of conceding the French throne. Just some years later, King Edward's son, Edward of Woodstock, now ruling over Gascony and Aquitaine as its prince, would raise taxes in order to pay off an earlier campaign in Iberia which attempted to restore an allied Castilian king to the throne. This king, who had promised compensation to Edward for his service, would backtrack on his offer, leaving Edward diminished in men and wealth, leading him to abandon the Castilian king, who would again be overthrown later on and replaced by a pro-French king. These new taxes were not welcomed by Edward's subjects, and many within Gascony now sought the leadership of France instead, triggering the second phase of the Greater War. This time around, it would be the French who emerged victorious, taking advantage of Prince Edward's reduced resources and King Edward's later age. The outcome would be a mass reduction of England's mainland territories, though still preserving small and strategically useful pockets of land along the northern and western coasts. The war would have one final phase, during which France seemingly succumbed to an English resurgence, seeing English King Henry V married to the French king's daughter and officially named heir apparent to the French throne after a series of successful battles. However, Henry would die just months before the passing of the French king, leaving the throne to instead pass to his infant child. Without his capable leadership to guide the new dual kingdom forward, the union would gradually unwind and descend into chaos. England would be expelled from the mainland, France would be restored, and back home the English themselves would devolve into a dynastic rivalry that would utterly redefine English politics and culture for centuries to follow. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, England not only won the 100 Years' War, but was able to hold on to the whole of France? The consequences of an Anglo-French union at this very crucial point in the histories of both kingdoms are tremendous. As we've already mentioned, England had long drifted away from its earlier Anglo-Saxon roots, and while it had become fairly distinct from the mainland on account of several factors, its identity was still one deeply tied to the greater French culture. Of course, the French hadn't come into their own yet either, lacking the cohesive unity and centralization that would have been brought on by the later creation of an absolute monarchy to diminish the authority of other nobles and local rulers who might otherwise challenge or rebel against the crown. England was a unique occurrence which saw a vassal of the French king acquire a kingdom all their own, and then quickly begin challenging French hegemony within its own lands. What that all amounts to is that rather than looking at this as a war between two perfectly united kingdoms simply in pursuit of each other's land, we should instead see this as an internal struggle between rival claimants of the same emerging kingdom competing to define the ultimate identity of France. And it was only following the defeat of the English and their exclusion from the mainland that they finally broke off to become their own truly independent identity. While France arguably held greater potential for unity based on the closer histories and cultures of the mainland states, in contrast to the culturally diverse Anglo, Norman, Celtic, Franco-Scandinavian identities which existed within England, the English kingdom was at the time more politically united and better coordinated than France had been. Taking this into account alongside the differences between France and England, we could expect the English to be just as capable of maintaining its new lands and promoting unity within them as the French rulers of our timeline had been. Now, there are a handful of opportunities for the English to have taken the whole of France, but the clearest option would have been for Henry V to have lived long enough to serve as King of France and successfully lay the foundations for his heirs to succeed him, avoiding the chaos which followed his untimely and unexpected demise in our world. With the support of Brittany and Burgundy, Henry would proceed to quash any remaining opposition in southern France, securing the whole of the kingdom and eliminating any rival claims to the throne. Drawing these two duchies in to support the English cause had been no issue in our timeline. However, they both quickly lost faith in the cause upon realizing the change in English effectiveness without the late King Henry. But this time, things are different. Of all the kings to potentially unify these two kingdoms, Henry V is perhaps the best candidate. In England, he was able to promote unity among the masses while eliminating threats to his authority amongst the nobility. Like Edward III before him, he was also an advocate for the expanded use of English within the kingdom and would likely mandate its use by French officials while spreading it to the masses via the settlement of English communities in the northern and western coasts. Sporadic resistance is sure to continue in southern France for a number of years, forcing Henry to remain there longer than he anticipated, and postpone a crusade he had hoped to lead against the Muslims once the French matter was settled. Henry's rival claimant to the throne, Charles VII, had been instrumental in the revival of the European standing army, recognizing France's numerical superiority to Britain but lacking cohesion as a fundamental factor in determining which way the war would go. If Henry successfully defeated and captured Charles before this change was implemented, it might well leave both France and England reliant upon militias and mercenaries for quite a time. Optimistically, we could also suppose Henry has the foresight to recognize the greater division that exists within France would make a standing army increasingly necessary to preserve the peace. And so, in order to simplify things and avoid an early collapse of this union, we'll just assume that's the case, and Henry, like Charles later would, creates a permanent standing army for both France and England, funded by the kingdom's tax dollars. This transition would be gradual, with mercenaries and militias still in large-scale use for the time being, but eventually the new Anglo-French king would need an army capable of functioning as a single cohesive unit and whose loyalty laid not in the hands of a local noble or financier but the king alone. This new army model would be and had been especially valuable to the emergence of France as a dominant land power, helping the central government to consolidate its authority by force or intimidation whenever necessary. Henry's survival also puts a halt to what would have become the War of the Roses, keeping the throne in Lancastrian hands for perhaps a few more generations, or possibly seeing a fusion of the two royal houses as was the case in our timeline. This latter option becoming especially possible as the feud between the two houses could still be expected to escalate upon Henry's passing, though not reaching the same heights it had in our timeline. The new Anglo-French Kingdom would find itself on amicable terms with most of its neighbours, save for Castile, Aragon, and Scotland. Scotland, given that it remained the sole hostile force to border England, would become a prime target for conquest as the English sought to secure themselves on this front and prevent future alliances between the Scots and the continental powers. Castile and Aragon had been closely aligned with France during the 100 Years' War, with the French and Aragonese having worked to install Henry II as King of Castile during that issue we earlier discussed involving Edward of Woodstock and England's preferred candidate for the Castilian throne. These animosities would still linger, however the Anglo-French Kingdom would retain two allies within Iberia in the form of Portugal and the small Kingdom of Navarre. These two kingdoms would serve as checks against Aragon and Castile in both the east and west, helping to defend Anglo-French interests in the surrounding sea. It's difficult to pinpoint precisely what new political marriages and lines of succession would result from this drastic change, however it still seems quite likely that the Habsburgs of the HRE would marry into the ruling Spanish line and eventually dominate it, as the Mediterranean still remained a major theater of interest for the Holy Roman Empire, and given major Aragonese presence on the islands of Majorca, Sardinia, and Sicily, along with its later union with Castile, these territories would be especially valuable to the Habsburgs. The Netherlands, on the other hand, which had become a possession of Burgundy, might instead see total incorporation into the Anglo-French Kingdom, given the strategically valuable location of the Netherlands in relation to England and the danger that such a territory might pose if it fell into hostile hands. In our timeline, France had annexed Burgundy following the 100 Years' War upon the extinction of its male royal line. However, a female line survived and married into the Habsburg royal family, who claimed Burgundian possessions for themselves. This led to a war between both sides, which saw most of Burgundy annexed into France, save for the Netherlands. With the added strength of England bolstering France in this war, a total Anglo-French victory is drawn and the whole of Burgundy is seized, beginning what would become a long rivalry between the Anglo-French Kingdom and the Habsburgs. Because England is no longer confined to its island domain but now has major interest to preserve on the mainland, focus which would have been invested in naval development instead goes into building a greater standing land army. As a consequence of this, Habsburg Spain would rise as and remain Europe's dominant naval power for the next several decades, still stumbling upon the New World and drawing in tremendous wealth from it. The Anglo-French Kingdom would still establish colonies in the New World, and following its most likely sea routes would still end up roughly in what we'd recognize as the American Northeast and Canadian coasts, while the Spanish Habsburgs still acquired lands in the North American South and South America in general. While there's no guarantee that the events which led to the creation of the Reformed Church of England in our timeline would reoccur in this timeline, several factors still suggest Protestantism would rise in the new Anglo-French Kingdom. First, when we look at where Protestantism became prominent in Europe, we see it well concentrated within the north, especially in areas which are culturally Germanic or which hold historic ties to North German coastal cultures, possibly suggesting a social or genetic predisposition which made the faith more favorable here. Second, there's political motive to support Protestantism for the sake of standing in opposition to the dominantly Catholic Habsburgs in the Holy Roman Empire in Spain. In fact, Catholic France had done much the same in our timeline for the same reason during the 30 Years' War. Protestantism had also been growing within France prior to this, only to be aggressively suppressed by the government, but in a world where these two factions are increasingly at odds with each other, and given France's now unity with the pro-Reformation England and Netherlands, the possibility for Protestantism to become the dominant force within this United Kingdom becomes all the more likely. This trend of Western Europe being divided between two major empires, the Anglo-French and Habsburgs, would continue well into the future of this timeline, though precisely how far is difficult to tell. It's possible the Spanish Habsburgs become an extinct royal line and see attempted annexation into Anglo-France, similar to what had occurred during the War of Spanish Succession in our timeline, or perhaps the Protestant-Catholic divide within France ultimately allows the Habsburgs to incite a religious civil war within their rival's land, much like the 30 Years' War they had endured themselves. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.